All right, and so before we get started with our panel, we'll hear a couple words from our Director of WID, Joe Handelsman.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to Cultivating Connections. This is our annual event that was restored last year after COVID, and we hope it'll be a growing and continually exciting event. We really were excited to showcase the Kohler Fellows because they epitomize what WID is about, trying to unite disciplines that don't normally talk to each other or work together to create something that can't be created without either one. So that's just one example, and I hope you had a chance to look at the posters and find out some other examples of the somewhat unique ways that we are interdisciplinary. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I want to thank our sponsors, VWR, VentureBest partners, as well as the Kohler Foundation, which has supported the Kohler Fellows through several iterations of their program. We, of course, think that the current iteration is the best, but they have been a wonderful sponsor of WID through the Kohler Fellows. So with that, I just wanted to say thanks and welcome to WID and turn it back to Melissa.
And if you're interested in being a Kohler Fellow, applications are still open through the end of this month. All right, and so to get us started on our last portion of our Cultivating Connections event, I just want to share a little bit about why we're having this panel, which is largely in part based on students' suggestions or requests to have a panel talking about this really important topic. And so although this request came from students, hopefully as we go through our conversation today, we'll hear ways to be thinking about the importance of this topic at kind of all levels, regardless of if we are students, if we are faculty, and anyone or anywhere in between. And so to give a sense of the structure for our next kind of hour and a half or hour and 15 minutes together, so we have kind of 3 rounds of kind of big picture topics that we'll chat about. So I'll pose some questions to our panelists, give them a chance to respond, and then we'll open up for questions kind of for each of those sections. So we'll do maybe 2 or so questions. And so kind of every 20 minutes, we'll kind of slightly shift to a kind of different sub-component of this big topic. And then we'll end at the very end with some time for open questions, connecting back to previous topics or connecting to new ones. So the other aspect is that in addition to be able to ask questions throughout, we'll have some opportunities to engage via connecting to the slides through your phone. And so there's going to be some opportunities there, and I'll tell you a bit more about how to do that. All right, and so to get us started, I'll introduce our wonderful panel that we have here. So first, on my left, we have Carolee Dodge Francis, so an Ecology of Human Wellbeing professor and department chair. She's a member of the Oneida Nation and the first Native American to chair a department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Dodge Francis is actively addressing the shortage of American Indian and Alaska Natives pursuing careers in biomedical, behavioral, and clinical research. So for the last decade, she has been leading a research education program for high school students, which is funded by an NIH, and the program focuses on providing hands-on experiences in diabetes, endocrinology, metabolism, nutrition, and obesity research in the biomedical, behavioral, clinical, and social science fields. So through the program, students receive mentorship to help them develop the skills and knowledge necessary to pursue careers in these fields. Up next, we have Dawn Crim, an internal consultant in the Office of Human Resources at UW-Madison, and has been an effective leader, mentor, and manager with demonstrated skills in her 27-year career in state government and higher education administration. Crim has also been involved in community leadership, serving as the past chair of the Governor's Equity and Inclusion Council, president of the Rotary Club of Madison Foundation, and on the Edgewood College Board of Trustees and the Overture Center for the Arts Community Advisory Board. She's been recognized for several awards, including being named among Wisconsin's most influential Black leaders on the 2018 Black Power list by Madison 365, receiving the 2017 Penn State University School of Education Leadership and Service Alumni Award, and the 2017 Jefferson Award in Wisconsin. So Crim holds a PhD in educational leadership from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an an M.Ed. In Education Counseling from Penn State University, and a BA in Rhetoric and Communication Studies from the University of Virginia. And up next, we have Noah Feinstein, is the director of the Robert E. and Jean F. Holtz Center for Science and Technology Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The Holtz Center is an interdisciplinary research center that brings together scholars from various fields to examine the social, cultural, and ethical dimensions of science and technology. Feinstein is an associate professor of curriculum and instruction and science education at the School of Education. He studies how people make sense of science in their personal, social, and political lives, and how educational platforms such as schools and museums can help. Additionally, he works on problems relating to learning, education, and social change, and writes about environmental and sustainability education, public knowledge, and educational responses to the post-truth era. And at the end, we have Chi-Chi Mei, who is a faculty here in Wisconsin Institute for Discovery and in the Department of Medical Microbiology and Immunology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She runs the Multiscale Immunobiology Design, Algorithms, and Simulation Lab, which conducts research and training that focuses on mathematical modeling of infectious diseases. Dr. Mei is also involved in teaching and mentoring graduate students through several other programs at the university. So, with that, we have our lovely panel here, and before we hear from them, we'll take a moment to hear from all of you. And so, to kind of start our conversation, we'll have you respond to this question, which is intentionally pretty vague. And so you can follow the QR code here or go to menti.com and submit your response of whether you've had a mentor that looks like you. So yes or no. Again, interpret this how you choose to. So take another couple seconds to get those responses in. And I'll pose then our first question to our panelists, and hopefully we can think about how this question might connect to this first kind of section or segment we'll talk about. And so our kind of first topic that I'll pose to you all, who is a mentor, and what does it mean for mentorship to be diverse? And maybe we'll kind of start here with Carolee, if you'd like to share some thoughts on that. Yeah, so the mic will be that gray button there. Perfect.
Thank you. Poso, welcome. So, who is a mentor? I would like to say we're all mentors on different levels and in different areas. And I think that for me, my mentors were that. Mentors from my family members who did not come from an educational background, but then finding a mentor within academia is always a little more challenging. And I think even as I've come into academia, even though that was not my first calling, working in field in tribal communities across the United States was really my first passion, is always finding mentors in different sectors and different areas of my life. So most recently, I have found some great colleagues and mentors that look at some of the same research areas that I do here in academia. So I think, who is a mentor? I'm hoping everybody steps up and wants to be a mentor.
She's a mentor. See that? So what's great about that question, as I look at the numbers, very balanced, 20 to 17, and it really feeds right into what I have to say about who is a mentor. And what I have to say is anyone who takes an interest in you and who is willing to support you and provide guidance. And I have come to that because I grew up in Philadelphia, first-generation college student, and if anybody's been to Philadelphia, our neighborhoods are set up very tight. They're row homes. So we had 80 houses on my street, and we all knew each other because your neighborhood was part of your community that helped raise you. So I always felt like I had my immediate family, but I had my neighbors who also took an interest in what I was doing, how I was growing up, and our family did the same with our other neighbors. And so having that as a foundation in my life, when I went to college, I wasn't sure how to navigate because I was first in my household. And in our neighborhood, we were that first neighborhood where you were just kind of working poor, like right out of poverty, making it, we can get somebody through. So it was all new. We were all kind of learning together. And so when I got to college, I realized it was about who I connected with, who had an interest in me, and who I had an interest in. And that's how my mentorship was shaped and formed. It was from that early foundation. And I've taken that forward with me in all of the careers that I've had to be sure to serve as a mentor. And I've had the great pleasure of having mentors in my career and in my community at my church that have taken an interest and provided guidance. And so it's good to see that it's balanced because it really does cross the landscape. We all have many different identities and interests. And when you can find people who support you among those identities and interests, you'll go very far. So all of us, guidance and interests.
I want to back out a step and answer the question of what a mentor is by addressing the idea of what mentorship is. I think that mentorship is the set of relationships that you have that support you in becoming a great version of yourself. And that a mentor is anyone who plugs into that set of relationships, that someone can be a mentor to you without knowing it. In a set of glancing, seemingly casual conversations that show you a different version of your life. Or somebody could be a mentor in the way that we expect by being perhaps your PI and someone who teaches you critical skills and opens the door to important jobs. And one of those is not necessarily most important or more important than the others. To me, understanding mentorship that way also sort of speaks to this second question of how diverse mentorship matters, which is if you think about that mentorship as a network of people instead of a person or one or two people who you get handed off from one to the next in different career phases, you can think about those networks spreading across your field. And the way that if those networks are knitted together in a particular way, they keep your fields in the shape of a segregated city where there are folks that don't talk to other folks and don't know about their life experience. And if those networks mesh and cross and give people windows into lives and ways of thinking that are not like theirs, they are both a way out and or a way back in to a way of thinking about the world that is really important to you. And those meshing and crossing of networks can also change what the field is so that it's less of a segregated city.
So I'll just add to it. I think a lot of the answers already capture what I would think about when I think what a mentor is. So when I was listening to everybody and just kind of my thoughts, when I think about what a mentor provides is guidance, access, opportunity, and advocacy. And especially when you think about, I tend to think in terms of professional mentors. So, when it comes to personal guidance or someone to listen to, I think about diversity and mentorship, I've had a lot of that, right? So I've had different people, whether it's in high school, my geometry teacher that was an African-American female who was the first person that I saw that was a mathematician and an African-American female, to my biology teacher in 10th grade who was an African-American male. And the thing that I noticed about each of them is that they actually gave me the opportunity to do more, right? So they were the ones that would, not that other teachers wouldn't have, but what I noticed is that they would give me the benefit of the doubt, come after school work on this project. And those were key times in my life that actually determined my direction. And I actually didn't remember this until I was speaking with Laura Red Eagle, and she was asking me why I kind of got into science. But then when I think once I get to college and in graduate school, I probably only had one mentor that sort of looked like me. He was an African-American male, and he was extremely instrumental, and he was the one that would see me and say, okay, you can do this, right? Or caught me when I was falling. But since then, in my professional life, I don't think I have ever had a mentor that looked exactly like me, so, in terms of an African-American female in the science. And so I've had many other great mentors, and they would give me the access, or they would, kind of give me the opportunity to stand up and do this, or give a talk, or invite me to workshops. But those mentors have been very instrumental for me to have opportunity to be seen. So I think depending on where you are, but especially when we think professionally, I really think mentors are critical for you to have that access to be seen, which is really important in our field. So that's kind of, I guess, my mix of what a mentor is and the importance of diversity in mentorship.
I'll pose a question, kind of following up on what you were just mentioning, Chi-Chi, in terms of having kind of this, the idea of the most instrumental mentor. And I'll kind of pose to all of you, in terms of when you think about what that most instrumental mentor, if such a figure existed, why, when imagining that most instrumental figure, why is it that figure? What aspects of what makes up something that you might kind of be wanting, if that makes sense? Yeah. Anyone wants to chime in?
All right. Okay, so I'll just follow up quickly. So in terms of why I said that specific person that I was thinking about, he was a professor that was instrumental for me, is that was the time I was falling, right? And when no one else, and I was screwing up in college or whatever, but he still saw my, not only my worth, but my possibilities, right? When I was having trouble seeing it. And so he was one person, he was an African-American man. Then I'll say a second time in my life when I was already a professional person, but I was not, things weren't hitting, my grants weren't coming through, and I just could not see what was going on. I had another, she was a white American woman, and she was able to kind of encourage me to continue and show me what was actually behind the network, kind of like the matrix behind science. And so those two times were extremely critical, because that was kind of my not giving up, but getting close to giving up moment, right? And so for me, those mentorship relationships were really critical during that time.
I think growing up on the Menominee Reservation, about 3 hours north of here, Native Americans were, in my generation, least likely to make it to graduate from high school, much less go on to college. That was just not an expectation that school folks, K through 12 public school people, assumed that you would go on to college. So I think the fact that a couple of teachers put me in what you call now AP classes, even to get into college, because counselors weren't allowing us in, was an amazing step. And being a first-generation college student, we didn't know what we didn't know. So being able to do that, but then going off to the University of Minnesota, which for me was just daunting and overwhelming. And when your tuition check, back then you actually got checks, didn't go into some fund, didn't show up, and you didn't know how to pay for your books, how to pay for your rent, how to eat. I had a wonderful mentor from another Native woman from Minnesota who was finishing her residency, Dr. Kathy Annette, who went on to become the Indian Health Service director for the tri-state area, who took me under her wing and always made sure that, I had a meal. I knew how to navigate the system, connected me with others, so that I could make inroads in finishing my undergraduate degree, because many times I was pretty sure I was going to give up as I was standing in line, knowing my tuition check wasn't, my Pell Grant wasn't there, and wondering what I was going to do exactly. So I think that was a pinnacle time for me to make it through undergraduate degree program. But then when I went into graduate and went into the professional field, I happened to have another wonderful Dr. Kelly Moore, who was a pediatrician, MD, who really was that catalyst in the CDC and NIH world. So the STEM and the STEAM world, because I didn't know exactly how I could fit into that, but also how to translate that into the environment that I grew up in. So I think many stages, but the higher you get up into the hierarchy of academia, there are less and less that look like me. And so being able to be available for not only my colleagues, my graduate students, my undergraduates, or just students who are thinking about going to college or thinking about science is really important for me to be available for individuals. And I get numerous emails that just reach out to me and say, could you just talk to me? Could we set up a Zoom? I get PhD students who aren't even in this university who contact me and say, I'm stuck. What do I need to do? Can you help me? So for me, being a mentor is 24/7 for me, because there are so few of us in our field and within our population.
I think of a mentor that I had after I came here, a professor who's left to take an admin position somewhere else, who showed me a way of being in a university that felt good. And I remember him saying at one point, the simplest thing, which is I try not to say bad things about other people. And it made me aware of how much of that was going on around me, and how much of what I saw and felt like a hustle, and felt like complaining, and felt like different sorts of envious bitterness. And I think about the role that he had, not in getting me to this place, but in showing me a good way of being in it, in a way that made sense to me. And I think that a lot of the most influential mentors in my life have done that, have said, this institution may not make sense to you in all the ways that people usually live it. Here's a way to be in it that makes sense to you. And sometimes it's just giving you permission to live a version of yourself that feels more true.
Okay, we got it. It's something about the button. So when I think about a mentor that has really meant a lot to me, I was transitioning from one job in the university to thinking about another. So I moved here as a women's basketball coach. And so that type of work is very public. So when I began thinking about transitioning out, I couldn't just talk to people about it because they're like, oh, who's coming in the next season? So you're thinking about how to navigate. But the way I was a coach, it wasn't just about X and O's. For me, it was about shaping people's lives. It was about the whole student athlete, so student and athlete, and then what environment are we bringing them into when we bring them here? So I saw myself as the concierge of the university, but in athletics. And so when I recruited, I would talk with student athletes and their parents about the excellent education they were going to get, the amazing athletic program that we had. Then we were NCAAs and were doing really good things. But more importantly, what type of community I was bringing them into. I had the fortune of coming here and coaching at a time where women's leadership was really strong in Madison. And it still is, but at that time, Sue Ballman was the mayor of Madison. Deborah Mesqua was the fire chief. Catherine Lyle was the head of system. Tammy Baldwin, of course, was in the legislature. And I was able to bring them and say, this university will nurture you, but this community will help you grow into a leader. And so one of the times when we had recruits in, I brought in Lamar Billups from the chancellor's office, others from academic areas that they were thinking about studying, person from church, one of our deacons, and we talked with this family about what they would receive here. Just so happened she was the #1 player in the country. We got her. She came, but it was that holistic approach. Fast forward 4 years later, when I'm thinking about making a transition, still want to be in higher ed, but I knew coaching was just a part of what I do. But I love that intersection of partnership, of community, of campus. And I talked with Lamar Billups about it. And unbeknownst to me, they were going to be looking for a person to fill a role in the chancellor's office. And because of that community connection, I ended up transitioning out and ultimately moving into a position in the chancellor's office as the assistant to the director for community relations. But where his mentoring really came in was he noticed me and how I did my work, which was a little bit different than just X and O's. He saw the greater impact of how I coached. But then when I was hired, he sat me down and he walked me through the nuts and bolts of the job, not just the what, but the how and the who. And so in that role, it was local government. So if you know anything about politics, it was little p, thank goodness. I went to capital P, but it was little p at that time. But it was about what was not being said in the meetings, what was not, how people navigated when you were in the meeting, you saw this, but there were a meeting or 2 meetings before the meeting. He let me into the meeting and 2 meetings before the meeting, and how to really navigate and work with partners behind the scenes so that when you're then trying to move that work forward in the formal way that we do, you have actually already done the work. And that was the first time I had a mentor really fully unpack the how and the who. We always knew it was kind of who you know, but it was really who you know and how you know them and how you navigate. And I have done that for people that I mentor since then. And now I see myself as a mentoring boss, not just servant leadership or any of these other titles. It's about mentoring because you really set people up for success.
Wonderful. You've all kind of collectively transitioned us into the second question about how mentorship has shaped your own lives and careers, whether as mentees or mentors. But I'll maybe pose this to see if there's any other thoughts on this aspect of mentorship in your own lives. And then we'll take a couple questions from the audience. So any thoughts beyond those you've already shared?
All right, so I wanted to also make one other point. So I know we talk about like formal mentorship, at least for me, I was thinking about professional mentorship, but I also wanted to mention the fact that sometimes we find mentoring in the most unlikely places. So as I said, I didn't find a lot of mentors that were like, you know, women in science that were African-American, right? I probably had one at one time, but the one thing that I did find is even when I would be in spaces where maybe the people that are in the profession don't look like me, sometimes those that might be in the administrative staff might look like me, right? And oftentimes, like whether it's an assistant dean of students or something like that, where they might not be one of my professors, but I always would connect with them. There's been many women of color that have been my sounding board. So, and sometimes just because they're in that space, they see me. And that might be my safe place to go. And that they can give me information that I don't see, some of the things that are behind the scenes, and just give me also an opportunity to go into a safe place and talk about some of the issues. And they might not be working specifically in the science, but they know the people working in the science. So I wanted to make that point because for me, sometimes those have been my lifelines to make me feel like, okay, I do have a place where I belong, even for a moment. And then I go back into the world. So I just wanted to make that point that, those that are in our profession are very critical, but then there's all those other people that I know have carried me along just because they were there. And I think especially for those that are, I would say, critically underrepresented, sometimes someone sitting in the room during a presentation matters. And so for me, that has also been where mentorship, informal mentorship, has been impactful.
Any other thoughts on that? If not, we'll take a moment here to open up for any questions from anyone relating to any of the thoughts or ideas shared so far.
I have a question. So when I was an undergrad, I found myself, some of you said this, so it might resonate. I found myself not knowing I was looking for a mentor, and it ended up putting me in a position where the PI I was working with sort of became my mentor by default. And that sometimes was not a position that I wanted with that, or a relationship I wanted with that person. But then in grad school, it was very different because you're sort of seeking out the mentor that you want to study under. And so, do you have any reflections on when somebody, an undergrad even, might find themselves in a position where they're working with someone who maybe they're not comfortable with, but they don't know how to actually voice themselves because they are young and it is a new environment for them?
I would say that sometimes if there's another faculty member that you feel comfortable talking with, or if there's a grad student that you have a know well or have a relationship, and they're on perhaps another grant or something, those, you don't have to name names, of course, but you can always just say, here are my concerns, and, look for feedback, not only from faculty, but other grad students, because that's not the first time that happens. And oftentimes seeking out, like you say, seeking out a mentor when you're an undergraduate is a little more tenuous when you're trying to navigate, because you also don't want to put your position in jeopardy with your research PI. So I guess I would suggest there's a couple ways at looking at that. The other thing is, so I'm in the School of Human Ecology, and we have some amazing advisors. And so one of the things that I always tell students, if you have a good rapport with your advisors within the school, that's another stepping stone in which to seek out some information from them, because they will know where to connect a person, a student, depending on the situation.
Yeah, so I'll make a quick comment on that. I completely agree, because I think, especially when I was an undergrad, my mentors were the graduate students in the lab. So when I was invited to be part of this lab, I was really nervous because, clearly I didn't know what I was doing. But but the graduate students became my mentors, and they actually became my lifelong mentors. And that was important and helpful for me because they knew the professor and they know the personality of the professor, right? And so they can kind of tell you the inside ways that the professor might operate. So that has always been important. And just to follow up on our earlier topic on diversity, I think that also matters how diverse your group is, right? Because so that also gives undergrads or whoever coming in somebody to connect to.
The first thing to know is that it's totally common. In fact, a mentorship relationship which doesn't work out perfectly is probably way, way more common than the other thing. So the first thing to recognize is that it often feels like a failure. It feels like bad luck. Sometimes it feels like guilt. But it's important to recognize that it's going on all around you all the time, where people are matched with other folks, with potential mentors, either through an initial interaction that felt good or because of a match in topical interest or whatever it is, just by chance. And if you hit the jackpot and it works out great, that's wonderful. But if not, there are a lot of other people in your boat. So recognizing that it's common is the first part of the self-talk that gives you permission to do something about it, right? The second is that mentorship really works on the basis of a mesh and some sort of connection. Some sort of, and I don't mean a personal connection, I just mean some overlap in what you need and what someone can give. And they're not being able to give what you need, and you're not wanting what they have to give, is not your fault, and it's not necessarily their fault either. And so most people get that, especially if they've been around in the university for a while, and recognize that when someone shifts a little bit and starts hanging out in another lab group or something like that, that's a normal thing, right? I know it sounds like I'm talking about something else, doesn't it? I do want to say that sometimes it's not a match can be a mask for stuff which is really bad. People outside of academia often don't know how fraught the advising relationship is. I don't know if y'all have had the experience of trying to explain why it is you or a friend is staying with an advisor that feels borderline abusive or actually abusive. They're out there. People are in those relationships and they're staying in them because they feel like they can't. They risk their careers by leaving. I had a therapist tell me once, look, if you succeed but lose your joy in living, you haven't really succeeded. And there's a piece of this which is valuing yourself enough to know that there are other ways of living a good life. And sometimes there are risks worth taking to transition from one mentor to another. The last thing, I didn't realize I had so much to say about this, sorry, is this is another place where thinking of mentorship as a network and not a person is really useful. I love what you said, Chichi, about the graduate students being mentors for you. I feel like part of the reason the mentorship gets fraught is because you're expecting one person to be your person, right? And I always tell graduate students who are applying to work with me or in my department, is there more than one person that you can imagine working with? Because if there isn't more than one person that you can imagine working with, you should consider applying somewhere else where there's more than one person you could imagine working with. Things happen. Personalities don't match. People retire. People get sick. And thinking about who else fills the role for you of giving you the support that you need to grow into a great version of yourself. Recognizing that you get that from more senior graduate students or more junior graduate students, the other folks who are around you, and looking for that. So that if you find yourself at a critical point where your mentor isn't doing what you need, you're not suddenly without mentorship just because that mentor isn't doing it.
To mentor me on turning on a microphone. Thanks, Melissa. As a mentor, how do you recommend best supporting and mentoring mentees who don't look like you?
Thank you for that shift. I think I don't want people to think that the only person who can mentor you is someone who looks like you. Because as the panelists have shared, as the further up you go, the fewer there are. And so I love how Noah talks about it as a network. And if you think about it in that way, there's different aspects of your work that different people can provide input on. And people who have navigated where you're trying to go, look to them no matter what their background is because they've had success with where you're trying to go. So you sometimes have to really think about the end game versus the steps on the way to the end, because sometimes at the end game, you then work backwards and you unpack it for yourself. But that network really is the way to think about it, because there's multiple ways to get there too. And so that's what that webbing and the multiple backgrounds can do. And I'm also a fan of, and I've mentored people in science, even though I'm liberal arts, because sometimes what's nice about being mentored by someone that's not fully and specifically in your field is it helps you, it opens you up to thinking about things differently and approaching the work a little bit differently, because they bring something else to it, but it's still mentoring and problem solving. It's just not sometimes so focused. I find in academia, because people specialize in exactly what they do, sometimes they can't see anything else because it's so narrowly focused. And so having others can help expand that focus but still get you to the end.
Well, Native Americans only represent a very small percentage of the population, so that would be I'd only mentor a very small percentage. But in reality, the numbers looked more like the graph. It's a very even, dispersed balance, and in part because of the work, the research that I do, in particular, chronic disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and in indigenous populations. Well, that cuts across many fields of science. So my pool of mentees really represents a vast majority of students in those fields. So I think that some of my experiences navigating both indigenous and non-indigenous life really brings to the forefront how I can also assist those mentees that are Native and non-Native, so that they run across the same kinds of issues and the same kind of problems or barriers. And so it doesn't really matter if it's one particular underrepresented population. They're still going through that cycle of higher education, and we all have encountered many of the very same similar problems as we try to navigate and find out how do we be successful, and how do we achieve going through undergrad, graduate, and getting a PhD, and then translating that into a job market. So I think, as Don says, it doesn't really matter, because we are mentoring from the standpoint that we are here to be a catalyst to help students or other colleagues be successful.
This works. Okay, there. Sorry. Okay, I just wanted to make a comment because I'm going to try to address it from the point of view of, well, I guess maybe that's what we're all doing in terms of when you're thinking about your, academic advisor and a student. I think it matters who it is, and like if it's an underrepresented minority, and if your lab is not as diverse, right? That student stands out and sometimes stands alone. So I think, and sometimes people don't want to kind of stand out. So I think it depends on the student. But regardless, I think one of the biggest things is building trust, right? So even if that student doesn't look like you, but they see that you see them, they can trust you, you back them, you support them, you introduce them, you recognize their scholarship. I think those little acts will really build trust and confidence in you, that you're not only seeing them as this or that, right, but that you're seeing them as the scholar that they are, and you're trying to build that. So I think really one of the biggest things, and I'm sure it undergirds all kinds of relationships, but is building that trust and that credibility that they can count on you, right, and that you're going to defend them. Because I know for me, of course, I've had different types of students, even students that do look like me. I think still yet I have to build that, because I can't just assume that they've had the same experiences or they even want to talk about it. I had one student, it wasn't until they were ready to graduate that it ever came up. And I was sure that I assumed things were going on, but it was once that student felt comfortable enough with me to go there, to talk about some of those challenges, then they can talk about that. But until then, I had either we hadn't gotten to that place in our relationship where I hadn't earned that trust, so I couldn't assume. So I think for me, when I think about students that might, as a professor, I know I'm in a position of power versus regardless of what that student looks like, right? So I have to build that credibility and trust with them. So again, I think if you have a student that is really, like an underrepresented African-American woman, that might be a little bit more challenging, but as you build trust and credibility, then I think that mentoring relationship would become even stronger for them.
So, if I could say that this question is really about how do you mentor a student, just like our question, how do you mentor a student who is not like you, not just who doesn't look like you, because there are a lot of ways of being different. I've been the advisor of a doctoral student who was on the autism spectrum. I didn't know that. I just know that we fought a lot. And I found out at a certain point that our conversations were going to play out differently than any set of conversations I'd ever had with a doctoral student before. I have a doctoral student advisee right now who's a first-generation college student. Those students are both really different than me. I've also had a student who was a returning student who was indigenous and international and multiply minoritized. And there are a lot of ways of being different. And sometimes I missed at first what the most important ones were. And I think that the first thing is to be curious enough to learn what somebody is like and how they're different than you. And to recognize that that may take some time, and that having the set of interactions which can teach you what somebody is like and how they're different than you may go a little bit outside of the normal set of interactions, the sort of programmatic lab paper group interactions that you have. So figuring out to have them, giving yourself space to learn. The second thing, and this is written about a lot, but be explicit about what you know that somebody else might not know about the system that they have to navigate. This is particularly important for students who don't come from backgrounds which give them inside or tacit knowledge about science, about universities, about whether it's class knowledge or whatever it is, national, cultural knowledge. It's hard to figure out what you know already, because most of the most important stuff is stuff that you're not even aware that you know. So the best way that I've come up with to do that is to figure out every time where somebody says, oh, that's really useful, and I'm surprised, and I write it down. I'm like, oh, next time I should talk about this explicitly, because the students in the room might not know about that. Sometimes it's involved fighting for them to be in places like on-search committees where the tacit norms of the institution get exposed. But figuring out what that tacit knowledge is and then opening it up to them explicitly. The third thing is be open to other ways of being in this place and in this world, and recognize that someone else's version of career success may not look like yours. And sometimes when you're pushing hard to try to help them succeed in one way, they may be trying to tell you that that's not the version of success that they want. And that's sometimes hard to hear, because you're trying really hard to help them succeed. And the last thing is when you screw up, keep trying, because the screwing up part is pretty much inevitable, and the keeping trying part is what makes it work in the long run.
Is it on? Oh. I just wanted to ask, like, what role, if any, has peer mentoring played in your career development? Because that's something that I would say has played a big role in my development as a professional and a scientist. I'm just curious what has been your experiences with that.
Since I never had any peer mentoring, that's a really hard question. However, having mentored Native American students, I have found that peer mentoring is very important. When COVID hit, I think Chi-Chi talked a little bit about this, but we basically stopped all human subject research. So in order to continue our NIH summer program, I had graduates of my summer program from prior years be the actual mentors for the high school students who were 11th and 12th graders. So we did a lot of peer mentoring in that way. And the population that we served with the summer program was Native American students and Puerto Rican students. So we had a good mix of alums, basically, who did the program and the mentoring. And it was an amazing experience because since we couldn't have our traditional labs that we would have our students in, everything was done via Zoom. We looked at big data sets and did secondary data analysis. And I learned a lot from that peer mentoring because in some cases, students were undergraduates in their first year because NIH basically stopped the summer of 2020. And so it wasn't till the summer of 2021 that we recontinued, but it was still all virtual. So I highly believe in peer mentoring, and I also here at UW-Madison try to make those connections with graduate students and also undergraduates. But I feel it's a practice that it takes a lot of nurturing, and it takes a lot of, as Chi-Chi said, trust building and relationship building. So mentors have to be willing to put the time and work and effort into doing that because it doesn't just always percolate to the top and happen by itself.
And I'll just add, I just finished my PhD 2021, and I was a working professional, and the peer mentoring was so important for me during that time. I had started a program 5 years ago and said I was going to take one class every semester, no matter what, including summers. And so in those first classes, you notice who's in the class with you. And then as you begin to progress, as you're talking with one another, you're starting to figure out what the course plan is. So I would meet with an advisor and I was like, she was really helpful with this and this, you should. Then they did. Then they applied to speak at a conference and they were like, oh, when the conference application comes up, this is what they're looking for. So what's nice about the peer mentoring is you can begin to navigate the space and the processes together where you don't always have to be first. If a peer is there, they may be, but they can share. And then before you know it, you're sort of sharing this web of how to navigate. So Noah had mentioned sometimes you may have a mentor that sees success one way, which might be a little different than your way. I had a faculty member who I was in her class, and it was really clear that she was really about turning out faculty. Well, I wanted to be a practitioner. And so as I was in her course, just the way she taught, when you went to one-on-one meetings, you could tell her advice, her information was very preparatory to be a faculty member. And so I was able to share that with other people that wanted to be practitioners to say, you may experience this. And we were able to think about which faculty members understand the route for the practitioner and what experiences they may need, what type of extracurricular work that works alongside the research would be helpful. And because of the peer mentoring, it made navigation a lot easier. So as we were filling out our plans, I graduated, but there's a student who now is in her second year. I gave her copies of both plans and was like, this is what she said, here's the courses, just walk it up. And she's already shared hers with 2 other people to do the same thing. And so I think peer mentoring is incredible because you're sort of experiencing things on the same track at the same time, but you might want to go in different directions, and you can inform and provide insights to who can help and how to process and navigate.
Peer mentoring is the best. And the longer you stick around, the more important it becomes. At a certain point, you look around and you're like, well, that's what I got, you know? But also, I survived graduate school because of peer mentoring, because of what we were calling a writing group, but it was really mentoring in the way that we helped each other figure out how to succeed and survive. And I think that that's a very common experience. I think that most people that were not deeply traumatized by graduate school in one way or another got out with their souls intact because they had some people to do it with. It's very easy. I still feel like those people, some of whom are not academics anymore, and none of whom are in my exact field, are still showing me how to sort of navigate the system in a way that makes sense. And I think that it's easy to lose track of those folks because they don't feel like they're closely connected to what it is that you're trying to accomplish explicitly. But yeah, peer mentoring is the most important thing, and it speaks to something else that the formal mentors can do, which is to recognize the power of that, encourage it, make space for it, ask if people have a writing group, make connections with other graduate students who your students might get along with, connect them to places where they can find those writing groups. Because this is another thing that, for instance, first-generation students often don't know or don't get. And it's a thing that you can help. You can say, I mean, if your students have good peer mentorship, then that's less that you have to do too.
I'm just going to make one comment, and that's that the peer mentors, right, that network, clearly in the future, those are going to be the people that review your papers, that review your grants. And so it's really critical, I think, to form it right now and to encourage it.
All right. I am currently a first-generation undergrad, and it's funny because prior to college, I didn't even know what it meant to have a mentor or what mentorship would mean. When I was having my first meeting with my PI about potentially having a research project, I said, well, should I talk to my advisor? And she said, well, I am your advisor. And so I guess for me, a lot of this is new, and it's been very transformative for my life. And I was curious what advice you may have for your younger self, whether it be undergrad or graduate school.
Do you mean what advice specifically related to this topic? Can I say first, it's awesome that you're here. There's some advice about understanding what brings you joy in your life and holding on to it through the rigors of whatever career journey you take through academia. I remember at a certain point that I lost track of reading for pleasure. And the point where I found my way back to that was a point where I was like, okay, I'm going to make it. So I would advise my younger self, look at the things that keep you going, that make you happy, that bring you joy, that may be disconnected to whatever it is that you're doing for your career work, and keep doing those things.
I applaud you for coming up and asking a question. My younger self would never have done that, would never have raised my hand, would not have asked a question. And I see that a lot in our population. Oftentimes, they won't ask the question. They feel perhaps that they're, disturbing someone, or they don't feel confident doing it. So I would say, be confident, ask the questions. That's why we're here, because we don't know what you might be seeking. And so for us to better assist students, at any level, you have to have a conversation and a dialogue with us. I always encourage my students, if you'd like to come have coffee or tea, I'd be more than happy to do that. It doesn't have to always be such a formal setting. I think that as a first-generation student, it's difficult because you're stepping out of your comfort zone, not only within your population, but also outside of the comfort zone of family. And I think that sometimes it's difficult to go home and tell them your problems, but they don't quite understand what you're talking about, but that's okay. You need to still keep talking to them. For Indigenous people, it's not always about the student wanting to go to college, their decision, it's a family decision. And it's a family decision oftentimes when we think about going into research. One of the most common things when I would go to Alaska from the parents would say, will my student come home? They're worried about losing their students, going to college and never coming home. But if we can show how going to college really impacts not only the student, the family, but the community, then that's what we're here to do, is to show that more holistic picture. So I applaud you for asking the question.
So I would add to my younger self and you to remain curious and to show up at things. And the reason I say that is when you think about being in this environment first time, so there's so many firsts, and you think maybe you know what you want to study, but you may go to something and it shifts kind of what your initial thoughts were. So, for example, today, when we saw the dance performance, it was awesome, by the way. I have a son who is a dancer, and we decided, he was like, Mom, I just want to dance right now. I want to go to school. I was like, that's fine. Go dance. So he's 23, and he's now starting to think about college a little more. So when I watched the dance performance and the scientific components and the heart rates and all that, I took a few pictures, got a little email queued up to say, your passion is dance. Have you thought about this part of dance or this aspect of dance? And so by showing up and just being curious, you'll hear something or see something that may shift what you originally thought or how you thought about navigating. The other thing about being curious and showing up is all of these other people are here. You're going to be in Union South one day at something else, and you're going to look and be like, wow. And so by showing up, your presence starts to build these connections that you don't necessarily realize who else is in the room, and then you'll be at something else down the line, and 2 or 3 of those same other people are in that room. And they may have saw you or you may have saw them, and you make a connection. So that curiosity of what's out there, and then that showing up that makes those connections, I would say that's what I would continue to tell myself. Be curious and show up.
Okay, very good. So I really liked what you said, Dawn, because I was thinking about I was trying to figure out what I would say to my younger self. I feel like I'm still younger, so, I don't, But I think that showing up is really big because I think sometimes, especially when you're the first and you don't have as many voices that have been there to give you feedback, we tend to shrink back. We tend to quiet our voices. We tend to whether you're ignored or whether you're not called on, whatever. But at times we can come into it enthusiastically. We have ideas and stuff like that. But sometimes at some point it becomes clear that your voice is not the one that they want to hear. And so then we pull back. So I think sometimes it takes a lot of fight to keep showing up, to keep putting out your ideas, to keep going. And I think that would probably be what I would tell my younger self. Don't stop. Don't silence your voice. And then don't give up on your ideas. Your ideas do matter. Just keep throwing them out there, because I don't think we're taught how to fail and keep going, because sometimes if you don't have that community or that mentorship, they don't encourage you to keep going, or you don't feel like you have as many chances to make mistakes. So I would definitely say keep showing up. Your voice does matter. Keep showing up and saying what you think, and don't give up on your ideas. And the last thing is, don't lose your joy, because as you go forward, academia, research, science can really, kill your joy in terms of your self-worth. But that's why,
There's a T-shirt.
When we think about mentorship and community, really hold on to your joy. I think that's the other thing. Rejection. Sorry, I can't.
Is this on? Okay. Thank you so much to the panel for all your insights. My question is, so as a mentor, how do you work on growing so that you continue to provide guidance and support to the people that you mentor, especially like you've mentioned before, when they walk maybe very different paths than your own?
Culturally speaking, I have elders that I oftentimes talk to. Sometimes just going home to the reservation and being at home brings peace to me. Occasionally reading things that are fiction and not epidemiology reports and journal articles all the time. So spending an hour watching Hallmark always is refreshing sometimes. Don't laugh. Sometimes you just gotta declutter your brain, and I know they all end the same, but it's okay. So I think finding ways of balance, so whether it's spiritually, being around other colleagues, so that perhaps we might have a little bit of a gripe session. Being frustrated because we've submitted a publication for the 5th time and it's not being accepted, and, letting that frustration out. I think as a mentor, we have to find that balance, because our lives are very ingrained in academia and our students, and I always want to be very positive with my colleagues and students. And so in order to do that, I need to find ways in which I bring balance, work-life balance, to myself. So that's the way that I do it. And Hallmark's on channel 72.
So I just wanted to say one thing that I'm learning in terms of as a professor or whatever is that I can learn a lot from my students, and I need to be humble enough to learn from my students because they're actually the ones that maybe bring new tools, or just even, as they come through, they have totally different perspectives on, on things, or, they might recommend that we do something different as a lab to integrate with other labs or whatever, but just being open to not only that top down, but that bottom up learning. is one of the ways. And since I've joined, I've only been here for a year, but the mentor training programs that they have here are pretty amazing. So, I'm just starting to realize there's other resources for me to actually become better at being a mentor, because no one really tells you how to do it. So I think for me, those are at least two ways that I'm really learning. Is just being open, especially to learning from my students, is one thing that's mattering for me, I guess.
We have a problem listening to our own damn advice. And I think that part of this equation is, like, you give your graduate students good advice and you don't take it yourself. And one of the things which, like, I hear us saying a lot, and I'm thinking about what we should do. I love what you said about learning from your students. Another thing is figuring out how to reconnect to the intrinsic side, the intrinsic motivation side of what you do. So, like, extrinsic motivation is being motivated by the rewards and the accomplishments, and intrinsic motive and the promotion points and all the things that you have to think about. Intrinsic motivation is like, why did you do this in the first place? Like, what keeps you going in it? And it's very hard to keep hold of that, because there's so many stages in the STEM career ladder, in the academic career ladder, really in any career ladder, but academia does this really well, where you got to pay attention to grades, and you got to pay attention to publications, and you got to pay attention to promotion, whatever it is. It's hard to keep hold of the intrinsic motivation side, but being interested makes you interesting to your students as well, and you have to feed yourself. And making choices to grow yourself that accord to your interests is going to feel selfish sometimes. And I think this is an important point to call out, because I think that people who are underrepresented in the academy often feel like they can't make selfish choices because of the burdens that they feel uniquely on them, including the burdens of mentorship. So you feel like you can't pick a project that you want to do just for fun, because it's not going to fund your students as well as a project that you're less interested in, but it's a safer line of funding. Or you're doing service all the time, and so you don't have time to do the writing that you want to do, which is why you're interested in the thing. And I think it's important to recognize that your vitality in your career is going to keep you in your career, is going to keep you lively and enjoying. It'll help you model what a good life looks like to your students. And sometimes the best way to grow is to make choices that are going to feel selfish sometimes.
We'll do one more question before moving on and wrapping things up.
So I was wondering, as mentors, how do you approach facilitating independence in your mentees, especially if your mentees come from underrepresented backgrounds and don't really have any other support options within academia and are not really like familiar with the workings of academia? Yep. Thank you.
So in terms of trying to facilitate independence I would say in terms of for my students, I do, and those are here that are here. Okay, they're not here. Okay. So I try to give them opportunities to, do certain things that are needed to move towards independence. And as I think about an academic or research career, whether it's presenting their work, writing, things like that, teaching them some of the inner workings of how, like, building collaborations, networking, and kind of their importance, and giving them opportunities to go to conferences, those kinds of things. And then also in my lab, I always have graduate students train undergrads, right? So they can kind of experience this mentor-mentee type of relationship as well. And as they get more senior, as they become more senior, they're also kind of, they're contributing to ideas, hopefully contributing to proposals, those kinds of things. So I try to do that. and also encourage them to voice. So now when it comes to underrepresented minorities, I mean, I've had, I guess now I would say 2 underrepresented minorities, and I have women graduate students. I think I try to make sure that they get a chance to be seen, whether they're presenting, whether they're, and I also try to give them credit and try to, as they move along, bring them to meetings that might make sense. Those are some of the ways that I try to give them the opportunity to speak, to interact in a professional way multiple times so that once they leave the lab, they feel very comfortable in that setting. And also the opportunity to kind of lead in research. So that's kind of some of the ways that I think about it in doing that.
I think in echoing in that, opportunities is really important. And so oftentimes I will put groups of students together, and I'm always looking for conferences or publications that are looking for new research, or so I will, and probably I push a little more, will ask the students who's willing to write the abstract. I will always be on that team. And so they have, in our school, they have what some of my students call Team Dodge Francis, because I will coordinate with students to make sure that they are submitting some publications and their first authors, or they're submitting some posters, or they're submitting some conference talks. But one of the ways to do that, because there isn't usually enough money within our school for travel and conference fees are so expensive. So whenever I write a proposal, I always put in travel money so that the students that I'm advising or mentoring, to make sure they don't have to struggle and try to get the travel funds necessary to go to the presentations. And, for me, it's not a question of me, it's a question of putting my students first and allowing them to have those opportunities, because in the end game, all of that looks wonderful on their CVs. And depending on whether they're going into academia or they're going back into community, you want them to have that type of exposure when they're here at the university.
I'm going to get all educational research on you. Sorry. Educational researchers talk about something called scaffolding, which is a term that you may have heard before, and it's just a sort of a very blunt metaphor. It's the stuff you put up on the outside of the building while you're building it that helps you climb up and build the build, so on and so forth. You get where this is going, right? There's a fancier word called the zone of proximal development, and that's what you kids. There's a set of stuff that you can do by yourself. There's a set of stuff that you can't do even with help, and in the middle there's a set of stuff that you can do with help. That's the zone of proximal development. That's where you're going. And figuring out what that is for your particular students, which involves knowing them pretty well. But like, okay, so I can see that you can do this, and you can't do this yet by yourself, but that's a thing that you can do with help. Either I'm helping you do that, or somebody else, an older graduate student, a more advanced graduate student, another faculty member is helping you do that. So I'm taking notes as y'all are talking, because there's so many wonderful ideas here about things that you can do, opportunities that you can look for. And figuring out what the ladder is, what the scaffold is, what the next task is that you might give someone is a really wonderful and thoughtful thing to do as a mentor for graduate students, especially from underrepresented groups. Recognize that people show independence in different ways, and sometimes it's awkward, where you feel like someone may have gone out on their own and done something, and recognizing that that is independence, and it deserves to be reinforced, even if you have to rein them in on a particular thing that they were trying to do, because it's going from experience that it's not going anywhere good, experimentally or whatever it is. But the reinforcing the heck out of independent thought and independent action is actually pretty important, because oftentimes students are nervous about it. And then giving them something that feels like a reach. I'll often encourage my later stage graduate students to put together a panel for a conference by inviting scholars who are more senior than them and trying to anchor it with a discussant who's really sort of frighteningly senior. And sometimes I'll tell them, you're actually doing work for these people, you're creating a panel that they only have to put their names on, and then they can get travel funds to go to the conference from their university. Anyhow, whatever. It's giving them a reach that helps them see themselves at the higher level of the next level of scholarship is something that I find really powerful. And that's it.
So what I want to add to it is I talked about by being a practitioner. So when I was the associate dean in the School of Education, we have 10 departments. We have students doing work, faculty doing work. Well, I was the associate dean for external relations. So I was in charge of events and publications. And so one way that I mentored graduate students and helped them kind of build their portfolio, be a part of the scaffolding, which was sort of outside of kind of the focus of the work, was I ensured that each time we did a publication, we did a story or two about a grad student. Every year we would go to AERA and we would make a booklet of all the presentations. And I would make sure, thank you for appreciating that, Noah, made sure that the graduate students were in there and the social media, we were hitting it, making sure that they were putting visibility to their work. And that's one way that somebody that is within the school that's not specifically tied directly to your work can still amplify your work. And by virtue of doing that, it gives the graduate students something that they can put on their resume that they were in the publication. It's the thing you can send home to your family and say, look, y'all, I'm doing this thing. But it's another way to reinforce, to support, and elevate the work just by virtue of you being a part of the department. I also worked with our alumni engagement. And so when I would meet with alumni and donors, I would bring students to talk about their work. And it gives the student the opportunity to articulate what they're doing, because sometimes it's really technical and your family will quite understand. And sometimes you are still formulating how to put it in terms for people to understand. So I was pleased to be able to give that ability for students to practice that work. And so it just adds to their portfolio as they're working through the research, the publications, and moving through the process. So some of those mentors are in other places that you may not have thought about, but are very helpful.
All right, we've had so many fantastic questions that were similar to some of the ones I would have posed up here, and were far beyond and better than some of them as well. And so as we approach the end of our time, maybe I can prompt us all to kind of end together in thinking about what aspects we're now thinking about as most important or of importance when we're looking for mentors. And so maybe I'll pose this question to you all in the audience, and you can go back to this website and kind of type some responses if you'd like. And maybe we can hear kind of one kind of final response from each of our panelists, kind of a key takeaway for what you would tell the students or the mentees in the room as what advice would you give them as they are seeking out mentors, or for the mentors, what advice would you give them? Any kind of final thoughts to share as we wrap up our time together?
There we go. It gets stuck, I think. Thanks, Matt. So I would say the one thing that that I would say personally is that I don't think I would be where I am without my mentors. When I think about like all of my achievements, outside of my family, the mentors have really made it feasible for me to stand where I stand. So I think mentorship relationships, they can last a short time, but then they can last like lifetimes. And I would say that the ones that I've had in college, both peer and those that were like my formal advisors, have lasted my lifetime. And so I think it's one of the most valuable relationships I've had. And they don't always, you don't always choose them. Sometimes they're just happenstance. And so I would say I think it's a very important aspect of my life, and I'm definitely grateful to all the mentors that I've had, and I'm trying to be a better mentor. So that's, yeah.
Sometimes you can be sitting in the audience feeling like, I'm not getting this, what's wrong with me? Or my experience of graduate school or undergraduate or wherever I am in my life is there's something up because I'm not connected to mentors in a particular way. And sometimes conversations about mentors can feel very dispiriting. I've been through periods where I did not have mentorship. And I suspect that happens to everybody. And I suspect that most people get through it. Or they change trajectory into something that feels better. So recognize that if you're going through a stretch where the mentorship isn't there, that happens. And seeing what you can do. I'm shamelessly pirating something from the National Center for Faculty Diversity and Development, so forgive me, NCFDD. They have this sort of picture, which is a web, which says, what are my needs? Where do I need mentorship in these different domains of my life? And then they force you, when you go through their training program, to fill those places in and see who might fit in that slot, And seeing the finding of mentorship is something that you can be active in, particularly if you think about mentorship beyond the sort of the single PI professional mentor model that many of us think of first.
I would say the key takeaway I'd like to share is just the importance of peer mentorship. And don't discount yourself in terms of what you may have to offer someone else. A lot of times when we think about mentorship, we think about capital M and that scholar, that guru. But really, we all have something to offer one another. And you feel really good about yourself when you share something with a peer that helps them. And I think it sort of adds to your own confidence as well. And so it's not always looking outside of yourself. It's appreciating what you bring to the table.
I concur with everything everyone has said, but I think one of the things that sticks out to me most is, yes, I would not have gotten to where I am without mentors. But I think I had mentors who saw me, who heard me, and who tried to assist me. So I try to model that for my students, that I hear them, I see them. I can't always guarantee that I can fix things or make things different, but I might know some folks that I can connect them to or introduce them to. I see myself as a catalyst in this setting so that perhaps I can show you some intersections that might help you in what your concerns might be with academia or how to move through our systems. But I think when you're thinking about a mentor, make sure your mentor sees you and hears you, and that you have a voice in this relationship, because that's really important. If you find someone who just talks over you, then you're not going to get your individual needs met. So hearing and seeing are very important to me as a mentor, but I think as a mentee, they should be important also when you're seeking out mentors.
Yeah, so as you, our panelists are responding, we have some responses here of what folks find as important factors. And so maybe what you responded is something new that you haven't been thinking about, given some of the experiences and advice shared today. And so as we wrap up, hopefully we'll all be kind of thinking about aspects of how to incorporate these ideas into our mentorship and in terms of how we are looking for our mentee or looking for our mentors. And so with that, I'd like to thank our panel once again for sharing their experiences. And with that, that concludes the Cultivating Connections event for this year. So thank you all for hanging out with us and for all the wonderful questions. All right.